Hello, good morning everyone and welcome to another engaging talk on Cebuano culture and heritage. To start with our forum this morning, I would like to ask the Vice President of Hambin, Mr. Ben Chua, to lead the invocation. Ben?
Let us put ourselves in the holy presence of the Lord. Our dearest Heavenly Father, thank you for making all things possible. We are grateful for all the blessings you are pouring upon each one of us. Despite all the challenges we are all currently facing, thank you for blessing us today with a wonderful opportunity, the meeting in virtually and learn together in the awesome, exciting webinar. May your blessing of wisdom and guidance be upon all through the sharing and impartation of knowledge and skills by our resource speaker, Professor Mike Cullinane, and our facilitators and moderators. May all of us learn together and upgrade our knowledge in our own local history. May we humbly commit every part of this webinar to you and bring you the glory, honor, and praise for your kingdom. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
In the name of the Father, of the Son, of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ben.
Mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
Kayang mag-ibig, lelos ng silanganan, alam ng puso, sa titik mo'y buhay. Lupang hinilang, kuya ka ng magiting, sa manlulupin, di ka pag-isigil, sa nagagang pulong ng silan. Langit kong pagaw, ay ginagang tulang, awit sa pagkayang minamahal. Ang isang ng matawad mo'y tagumpay na nagtitindig. Ang bituin at araw niya kailan pang ay di magtitindig. Lumalang araw ng buwan-haging pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Ang inigaya na pagkay mga amin, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Okay, again, maayong buntag ka natong tanan. Good morning, good evening at Denver, Colorado, where our speaker is
Morning. Good
based.
morning.
Um, yes,
Good evening, sir.
this morning is actually a part of a series of ongoing talks we have for Hambin. Hambin stands for Hamiling Binilin, or in English, it's Cherished Heritage. And Hambin is a group of pioneering and the only graduates of the University of San Carlos graduate course on Cebuano Heritage Studies. Our aim is to continue and sustain the ongoing conversation on Cebuano history and heritage. And without further ado, to introduce our speaker for this morning session, I'd like to call on the, she's actually the secretary of Hambin and currently the chair of the University of San Carlos Department of Anthropology, Sociology, and History. So let's all welcome Dr. Laila Labajo. Lai?
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's a privilege to introduce to you this morning one of the pillars of history, pure-blooded historian. He got his BA History and Asian Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, MA in Southeast Asian Studies, Ohio University, PhD in History, University of Michigan. He teaches Southeast Asian history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he has also been the Associate Director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies since 1991. He conducted research on Philippine history for over 40 years and have published numerous topics and quite a number of books and articles. He's a regular visitor in Cebu. He stayed in Cebu for many years. So kabalo siya magbinisaya, dili siya malibak. Among his popular books are Illustrado Politics, Arenas of Conspiracy and Rebellion in the Late 19th-Century Philippines, The Battle for Cebu, 1899 to 1900s, and among others. He is one of the persons responsible for the founding of Cebuano Studies Center of the University of San Carlos in the 1970s, 1972 to 1975, along with Dr. Rizal Mojares, Felix Sosango, and Dr. Erlinda Alboro. He is always called as the adopted son of Cebu and our personal friend of Hambin. So, ladies and gentlemen, maayong buntag sa tanan, let's welcome Dr. Mike Cullinane.
Yes.
Ready to begin?
Yes, Doc, go ahead.
Lila, thank you very much for that nice introduction, and I thank
Please
all
turn
of
your
you.
video on. Can you start your video?
Let me see. I thought my video. Start my video.
Okay, there.
I am. Wow.
Okay.
Tigulang na.
Wapo pa.
So I want to thank all the leaders of Hambin. Again, I thank Lila for her introduction. I see Cabino is there. Hi, Cabino. How are you?
You're welcome. Hi, Mike.
And good to see you. So I would, and mayong buntag sa tanan. I'm actually here in the middle of the night in Denver. So it's a little weird, but I'm glad that you guys are just waking up. I'm getting ready to go to sleep. So before I do that, I'll try to give this talk. So I drove to Denver yesterday, so my eyes are a little bit libat na. So but what I'll do is I'm going to give the talk, and I think I want to thank Boboy Cosas for showing the slides, and I'll tell you when we can change them. So we can start right now. What I'll try to focus on is reading the talk so that we can get through it. And then hopefully have time for question and answer afterwards. That's the big thing. So I've changed the title of this talk a couple of times because when I first was invited, I thought I would just talk about sort of the ancient Osmeñas, the Osmeñas from the end of the 18th century up until the sort of end of the 19th century. But having thought about it and realizing that there's other things that would be worth talking about, I've changed the title and I'm going to look at the old Osmeñas as well, but I'm going to also focus it because one of the more interesting aspects of Osmeña history is, first of all, the amount of land that the Osmeña family has owned over the years, but also how that land has changed hands back and forth between various parts of the family. So what I'll do now is I'll leave this slide on and I'll give a sort of an introduction. Is everybody hearing me okay?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So when contemplating the life of Sergio Osmeña Sr., the emphasis is on a remarkable young man born in Cebu City in 1878. A man who emerged from a somewhat modest urban middle-class background to become one of the most dominant Filipino politicians in the first half of the 20th century. He was a man born in the last decades of the declining Spanish Empire, a man who took the lead in the American colonial state, and a man who established the mold of post-colonial Philippines politics throughout most of his career. His political career ended as the president of the Commonwealth of the Philippines, 1944 to 46. This legacy is very real and no one can ever take this away. right? But it does not represent the whole story. In assessing Don Sergio's impressive career, there is little mention outside of Cebu of the vast wealth and land holdings that he came to control during his lifetime. In most accounts of his career, he has been constructed as an intelligent man with incredible political instincts, a politician whose only successful opponent was Manuel Quezon, and this is all a very real part of his story. Upon closer inspection, however, it is also very clear that he and his families, and I intended this to be plural, he and his families accumulated immense wealth and land holdings in Cebu and the Central Visayas. A conservative estimate of the size of his land holdings by 1940 would be more than 2,000 hectares of prime agricultural property in at least 12 of Cebu's municipalities. Right? The accumulation of these lands began more than a century before Sergio Osmeña's birth. The prominent place of the Osmeña family in Cebu did not start, as we know, with Don Sergio, who lived from 1878 to 1964. From the 1770s up to the time of Don Sergio's birth, the Osmeña family was already one of the wealthiest and most influential families in the city and province. The family's origin was by all accounts entirely Chinese mestizo, with its earliest ancestors identified as residents of Cebu City's Harian, right? And at the time, the most affluent and influential community in the entire southern Philippines. This talk will focus on the origins of the Osmeña family in Cebu and on the family's acquisition of urban and rural property and how this property moved among various members of this powerful family over a period of 170 years. It will also describe the peculiar conditions relating to Don Sergio's place in this family at the time of his birth in 1878. And will conclude with a discussion of how Don Sergio and Osmeña, only through his mother's side, managed to acquire nearly all of the assets of his grandfather, Don Severino Osmeña, while his grandmother and mother had been intentionally marginalized by the more dominant members of the family. We can go to the first slide then at this point. Okay, so we'll start then with the children of Alejandro Baltazar and Atanasia de la Cruz. I'm hoping and assuming that none of you know who these people are. So the earliest recorded ancestor of the Osmeña family in the records that I have seen is a man by the name of Alejandro Baltazar, a Chinese mestizo resident of Cebu City's Parian. He was married to Atanasia de la Cruz, who was also a mestiza sangle of the Parian. During his lifetime, probably we would estimate his life was somewhere between the 1770s and the 1830s. Alejandro Baltazar never used the surname Osmeña. So he was born and died and was never known as an Osmeña. We'll talk a little bit about that later. While he may have had siblings, none of them have been revealed in the records. At this time, it is evident that the family was relatively small. And that's rather a funny part to say about the Osmeñas today, that the Osmeña family might be small. Suggesting that Alejandro Baltazar may have been a first generation Chinese mestizo. If so, it allows us to speculate that his father may have been one of the 53 Chinos infieles, the non-Christian Chinese, who were expelled from Cebu by the Spaniards in 1773. If so, he was raised by his native-born mother, most likely a Chinese mestiza from Cebu City's Parian. We know very little about Alejandro Baltazar or of his wife Atanasia de la Cruz, only that they were natural de Cebu, Cebu natural del Parian, and that was often the way they were described. And we know that they were both deceased by 1840. Right? Sadly, there is not enough information in the existing records to determine the family name of Atanasia de la Cruz. That was her given name before apellidos were assigned to Filipinos in the late 1840s. By the 1830s, Alejandro Baltazar and Atanasio de la Cruz had at least 4 surviving children who appear in the city's records. 3 of them were daughters, and this is where you can refer to the slide, Regina Maria, Mamerta Dominga, and Cleta Sinfarosa. And they had 1 surviving son, Severino Agaton. By the 1830s, the 2 most prominent members of this family were Mamerta Domingo, who we believe died in the early 1860s and was married to Don Mariano de los Dolores, and we'll talk a minute about him. And the other more dominant person at the time was her brother, Severino Agaton. Right? And both were Chinese mestizos born in the Parian, where they resided during their entire lifetimes. From this time until their deaths, both Don Severino and his brother-in-law, Don Mariano de los Dolores, served as gobernadorcillos of the Parian. Right? So they were very prominent figures in the community that they came from. It was not until 1849-50 that Severino Agaton became Severino Osmeña Agaton, and Mariano de los Dolores became Mariano Singson de los Dolores. So we're seeing already that the Osmeñas were married into the Singson family at almost the very beginning of their history. Right? These names, of course, resulted from the decree of 1849 by Governor General Narciso Claveria, requiring the assignment and use of apellidos, of surnames, throughout the archipelago. This was the first time that the Osmeña family name appeared in any records I have seen. Its origin, that is the origin of the Osmeña name, at least for me, is elusive, since Osmeña does not appear in the Claveria catalog. He wrote a catalog of the Catálogo Alfabético de Apellidos in 1849. The name doesn't appear there. So you say, wow, did he take it from? There are some names that are close to this name that appear. There's an Osma, there's an Osemana, there are Esmeña and Esmeño, but the actual name. So when we try to figure out, is this a Spanish name? And then you look up in the legacies online of the name itself, and you find that almost all of the Osmeñas that are mentioned anywhere in the world come either from the Philippines or from North America. In other words, often Osmeñas who have become Americans at this point. So we can go to the next slide. So we'll start here with Severino Osmeña Agaton, and we're giving him some dates that are roughly from born around 1790, and we know his death date was 1861. So we'll say some things about him. By the 1830s, the leading figure of this family was Severino Agaton. At the time of his birth, of course, he was not yet an Osmeña. He's the patriarch, however, of the current Osmeña family of Cebu. He is the great-grandfather of the former mayors Tommy Osmeña of Cebu and John Osmeña of Toledo. He's their great-great-grandfather. Right? From the 1830s to the end of the 1850s, Don Severino and all the members of his family resided on the north bank of the Rio de Parian, a strip of houses and shops occasionally referred to in the late 19th century as Calle de Colón. Right, but it was for a lot of period of time known as Calle del Parian, right, for most of its time. Severino died here in 1861. Until 12 years before his death, the Parian had been the site of Cebu's most affluent Catholic parish, with its church standing as a solid stone edifice only a short walk from Don Severino's home. As a young man, he would have witnessed masses delivered at this church by the most renowned secular clergyman in all of the Central Visayas, Padre Pedro de San Rafael y Vasquez, right, the Parian-born parish priest of the Parian from 1791 until his death in 1829. As a leading official of this community, Don Severino joined other Chinese mestizos in the long struggle, a struggle that went from 1829 to 1849 to defend the Parian against the persistent efforts to suppress its parish and to counter its claims on the city's hinterland against the Augustinian order, against the Augustinian bishop of the time, Fray Santos Gomez Marañon, who was the bishop from 1829 to 1840, against the Spanish provincial governor Manuel Romero. And I will notice that if you are wondering, if you want to find the name of Manuel Romero anywhere in Cebu, go to the gate of Fort San Pedro. His name is proclaimed on there, and this is precisely the time that he built that gate and renovated Fort San Pedro, and he was one of the major figures in the effort to crush the Parian. Right? The other person here was the Spanish Gobernador Intendente Manuel de la Canal. While the Chinese mestizos, along with Don Severino Osmeña, put up a valiant resistance for 2 decades, from up until 1849, in 1849, the Parian Lutao's church and community were suppressed. And I write a lot about that in other places. At this time, Don Severino, now an Osmeña, and all of his relatives entered what was called the Gremio de Mestizos Sangles, Sangleyes, and this would be the Gremio of Chinese mestizos. And for the first time, the family became parishioners of Cebu City and began to attend Mass at the cathedral. So until this time, they had not. Right? As an active comerciante, a merchant, during the early years of Cebu's economic boom, starting in the late 1830s, Don Severino was at the forefront of these developments. Along with many other prominent Parianos, he was an active shopkeeper and inter-island trader, right, who was concentrated on provisioning the relatively small urban area of Cebu City by controlling the movement of commodities from the city's accessible hinterland and elsewhere in Cebu and the central Visayas. Right? He was very much a part of all of these activities. They were mostly what these activities were, and during this time was the time that the city of Manila began to open up as an open port to the world. And the city of Manila began to have demands on products that came from other parts of the Philippines, including the Visayas, and including, for our purposes, would be abaca and azúcar, the 2 main crops that come out of this area that were going up to this area. Like a few others at this time, Don Severino took the lead in expanding his urban property and became known in the records as a propietario, a property owner. He also acquired urban and rural lands that could produce these commodities of sugar and abaca. And he became known at this point in the records already as an hacendero. So we see, I put on the slide all of the different titles that he could be called. He was a natural vecino del Parian. He was a principal y gobernadorcillo del Parian. He was a comerciante. He was a propietario, and he was an hacendero. So he had it all. I mean, he was very strong in his community as well as being a major figure in it. Don Severino maintained his family's business headquarters in Parian throughout his life, but rapidly expanded his land holdings into Cebu City's hinterland to nearby Talamban, and increasingly to Carcar and its adjacent barrios and municipalities at the time. At the time of his death, only 1 year after Cebu City itself was open to international trade, Don Severino Osmeña and a handful of other Chinese mestizos had already taken the lead in the diverse commercial activities that would define the economic developments for the next century. 5 of his sons picked up in 1861 where their father left off, and were by the end of Spanish rule among the most affluent and influential figures in the central Visayas and the leading vecinos of the Ciudad de Santísimo Nombre de Jesus. we can go to the next slide and look at some of the next generation. I hope you can read this. It's a little crowded because above all else, Don Severino had a lot of children. We'll see this. So Don Severino married twice. The first to Doña Vicenta Rita, usually just spelled Rita, R-I-T-A, whose pre-1849 death has prevented us from knowing her family origin precisely. While it is certain, however, that she was a Chinese mestiza. She was referred to in that way in many records that we have seen. His second wife was Doña Paula Josefa, right, before 1849. After 1849, she was Paula Josefa Suico, right, she was a member of the very prominent Suico family, also Chinese mestizo and also from the Parian, a family that the Osmeñas were already well married into by this point. And we could point out that Severino's sister, Mamerta Domingo, was married to Fermin Suico, a leading member of the Suico family, and that Paula Josefa Suico, who became Severino's second wife, was Fermin Suico's second cousin. So there was a lot of intermarriage among these. Based on archival records, Severino had 11 children with Vicenta Rita and 7 children with Paula Suico. That means that he had 18, of course, the work was being done by Vicenta and Paula, most of the work of having the children, but this is during this period, they had 18 children in what appears to be 30 years of marriage for Severino himself. In the first marriage, he had 5 sons. We'll be looking at them more carefully later, and he had 6 daughters, and we'll be looking at them later. In his second marriage, he had 4 sons, Lázaro, Seferino, Celedonio, and Apollonio, and 3 daughters, Damasa, Juana, and Filomena. Juana Osmeña y Suico, that was her name, was at about the age of 20, was the mother of Don Sergio Osmeña in 1878. By the time of his death in 1861, most of Severino Osmeña's children with Vicenta Rita were adults, having already been involved in their father's business endeavors and active in the leadership of the Gremio de Mestizos. At the same time, most of his children with Paula were still minors, an important reality that we need to see when we talk about what happens with the lands and the separation in a few seconds. So the names of all of these people are on this slide, but we will come back and look at some of them when we can go to the next slide, because I want to focus on a few of the important members of this family because they're not well known in the history of Cebu. Excuse me, I'll drink. So here we are with, I'm calling this Los Hijos Mayores de Doña Vicenta Rita. So the older sons of Severino and Vicenta Rita. The first on our list is Guillermo Osmeña Agaton, who was born around 1820 and would die in 1888. Guillermo, Don Severino's eldest son, was one of the earliest Cebuanos to obtain a formal education in Manila. Guillermo was sent to study at the Universidad de Santo Tomas in the mid-1840s. Where he graduated in 1848 as a bachelor en leyes, a law student, and remained in Manila as a practicing abogado, as an attorney and solicitor for the rest of his life, resulting in his marriage to a resident of Binondo, right? So he leaves Cebu to become a student, goes to school, obtains a high degree for the time, and is one of the first Cebuanos to go off and study in Manila, but he doesn't really come back. He maintains close contact with his family, but he doesn't return to live in Cebu. Right? While a licenciado and a resident of Binondo, Guillermo frequently represented prominent Cebuanos and the Parian itself in a range of Manila-based litigations, and was an active litigant before the Audiencia de Manila, along with his Cebu-born contemporary Catalino Veloso del Rosario. And I've talked about him in other writings that I've done. From Manila, Guillermo was also deeply involved in the increasingly profitable trade between Cebu, the Central Visayas, Northern Mindanao, and the opening of the open port of Manila, serving as a consignatario, as a consigner for shipments of commercial goods between the Visayan agents and the foreign business houses that were operating in the Manila in the capital. In addition, Guillermo also appears in Philippine history in another rather interesting way. Guillermo ran a small school. He was a maestro in Binondo and had his own private school session. And one of his most famous pupils was Andres Bonifacio, we believe sometime in the late 1870s. That sort of stands out as a thing that people often say about Guillermo. The other two sons of Severino and Vicente Rita both were born shortly after Guillermo, and one was Nicolas Agaton, born around 1822 and died in 1862, so he dies rather young, and Pedro Agaton, who died in 1876, and we're not sure, he was born sometime after Pedro. Both Pedro and Nicolas were very active during the lifetime of their father, Don Severino. The records indicate that neither was sent to study in Manila, but instead both remained in Cebu and were closely associated with their father's business interests, as well as playing significant roles in the administration of the post-1849 Gremio de Mestizos Sanglayes, having inherited their father's leadership in this community. The records also indicate that neither Nicolas nor Pedro was ever married and that both died single and relatively young. Nicolas, only 1 year after his father is when he died, and Pedro about 15 years after the death of his father. By the late 1870s, the only surviving sons of Severino and Vicenta were their youngest sons, Don Tomas and Don Victoriano. But first, let's discuss the hijas. So if we go to the next slide, we understand in the Osmeña family, as we should, that the women were very powerful in many things that happened. So we'll take a look at the hijas. The list on the slide are the children, the daughters of Vicenta Rita and Severino Osmeña. 3 of the daughters of Severino and Vicenta never married, and as far as we can determine, they did not have any children out of wedlock. We can never always be sure of this, but this is what it looks like. These 3, Inocenta, Basilisa, and Claudia, remained mga dalaga, but were routinely included among the shareholders and stakeholders of the family's extensive estate. So they were not eliminated from the system at all. They became prominent members of the family in terms of the assets that the family develops. The other 4 continued the Osmeña family's inclination to marry into other leading families of the Parian. In other words, to marry into other Chinese mestizo families. Leoncia Osmeña married Vicente Noel. Crispula married Gavino Suico Mariano. Again, another marriage to a Suico. Gavino Suico and Paula Suico were first cousins. Right? Edu Vijes married Mariano Espina. Right? Clemencia married Vidal Veloso. So what we see here is 4 Chinese mestizo families that they married into. In terms of strategical marriages at the time, it is difficult to imagine how they could have been better choices. These were fabulous choices for if you were trying to figure out which family to marry your daughter into, if that was taken into account at the time. These were excellent choices. All of these men who they married into their husbands were affluent leaders of the Gremio de Mestizos and prominent figures in the larger urban society of Cebu. Nevertheless, after 1849, their children entered, these children and the children of these women entered more permanently into genealogies of their husbands. In time, incorporated into other families, the Noel, the Suico, the Espina, and the Veloso. where their Osmeña roots were obscured by the family names of their husbands and their children, becoming, after a generation, of course, the mga igagaw of the Osmeña extended family. And igagaw, of course, as we all know, is a term that you can really play upon over long periods of time. But these are all real families that developed large numbers of igagaw. If we look at the next slide, we're going to look at the younger, okay. And the reason this is so long is we're going to look at the two younger brothers of Don Severino and Vicenta Rita. And we can see that, that in the case of Tomas, he only had 2 children, both women. But in the case of Severino, the family was much larger. So we'll talk about these younger or minor sons, if you will, of Severino, who, remember, by the time we get into the 1870s, these are the only male members of the family who are still alive. The 2 youngest sons of Severino and Vicenta, then Tomas and Victoriano, came of age at a different time. They came of age during the 1870s to the 1890s, when Cebu City was undergoing rapid development and emerging as a far more distinctive Hispanic urban area and an economic, bureaucratic, and educational center in the Philippines. In this milieu, the 2 Osmeña brothers prospered. Like his older brother, Guillermo, Tomas was sent to Manila to study, completing his secondary degree also at Santo Tomas, and became a bachelor in philosophy and leyes canonicos, or canones, in 1856. So he goes to Manila, he studies, and then he comes home. Unlike Guillermo, Tomas returned to Cebu and joined his siblings in working with their father in the family enterprises. With the passing of their father in 1861 and with the death of their older brother Pedro in 1776, Tomas and Victoriano became the most significant heirs of their father's bienes, his lands and wealth, and his position in the community. While Guillermo and all the daughters of Severino married Chinese mestizos, as we have pointed out already, Tomas and Victoriano chose spouses outside the Parian. Right. Their wives were Spanish mestizas, cousins, and direct descendants of Cebu City's most prominent Creole families from the 18th century. Tomas married Agustina Rafols y Cabrera. Victoriano married Januaria Cabrera y Lucero. They were themselves related. They were cousins. Right. In an intriguing possibility, or it is intriguing and possibly intentional that these marriages linked these 2 prominent Chinese mestizos of Cebu City to the past, to a past that was dominated by a small community of Spanish settlers until the middle of the 18th century, at which time the residents of the Parian, among them the Osmeñas, took control of nearly all aspects of urban life. But so Don Tomas and Don Victoriano were now linked to that older Spanish past. And we can look up the next slide. So here we want to look at, we're going to switch and look at the second marriage of Don Severino. I will first focus on the whole family, which is listed here. I'll then talk a little bit more about the sons, and then we'll save the daughters because among those daughters is one Osmeña, the mother of Don Seri. We'll save that for the end, but because I want to start talking a bit about the lands. So we're looking at the children of Severino, Agaton, and Paula Josefa Suico, right? Not long after the death of his first wife, Vicenta Rita, who died, we believe, she was dead by 1848, Don Severino remarried a much younger woman. We believe that she was his minor by some 30 years. This was Paula Josefa, who was born, we believe, somewhere between 1831, but dies in 1906. Doña Paula, despite her age, was a remarkably empowered woman, one who entered her marriage with Severino Osmeña with her own property, with her own entrepreneurial relationships across the urban area, even as a young woman. While still a minor at the time of her marriage, she had already inherited considerable property and wealth from her many Suico relatives, especially Estanislao Mariano Suico, who was her uncle, right? Whose son, as we mentioned, was the universal, his then universal heir of him was Gabino Mariano Suico, who married Severino's daughter from his first marriage, Crispula Osmeña. So we're again, the Suico-Osmeña link in the early Osmeña history is very clear. Throughout the marriage between Paula and Severino, throughout the marriage and afterwards, Paula remained she retained her own property. She engaged in her own commercial endeavors, which in the 1870s and 1880s included her own house, including a warehouse in which she maintained one of Cebu's two largest panaderias. So she was her bakery shop, located at the heart of the urban area. Nonetheless, we shall see that after the death of her husband, Don Severino, she and her children were increasingly separated from the benefits that should have accrued to them as the heirs of one of Cebu's wealthiest residents. Despite her disenfranchisement, Paula took her own place in Cebu City society, where she became a formidable urban persona, widely recognized as a proprietaria, as a landowner in the city. For the most part, however, she and most of her children were kept apart from the family's primary assets. Let's go to the next slide and look at that. So now we're going to look at the hijos of Doña Paula Josefa Suico first, the sons, right? And if we look at the sons, we see there were 4 of them, and we'll talk a bit about them. Although the paternal origin of the children of Severino and Paula can on occasion be questioned, the couple is reported to have had, as noted, 7 children between the end of the 1840s and the death of her husband in 1861. There were 4 sons and 3 daughters. While all 7 could claim descent from the patriarch and his second wife, only one among them emerged as a leading figure in the life of Cebu City and its province. This was Don Lazaro Osmeña Agaton, born in around 1854, the eldest son of this relationship. Throughout the 1880s and the 1890s, Lazaro Osmeña established a secure place for himself in the life of Cebu City, in part by his marriage into one of the city's most prestigious Chinese mestizo families, the Gandioncos. Right. His wife, Celestina Gandionco y Normandia, was the daughter of Gregorio Gandionco, the eldest son of the family's patriarch, Don Domingo Gandionco. Moreover, Lazaro in his own right became a prominent figure in the economic and social life of Cebu City, and I might add as well in the Gremio de Mestizos by the end of the 1800s and into the early 20th century. While Don Lazaro's younger brothers appear to have been denied the inheritance of their Osmeña Rita siblings, many of them prospered in the last decades of the Spanish rule and in the early 1900s by migrating to northeastern Cebu. 2 of Doña Paula's sons, Seferino and Celedonio Osmeña, acquired commercially productive lands in Danao and Carmen, where they married into the leading local families, Gonzales and Buot, right, and established themselves as members of the growing provincial elite at the end of the 19th century. Apolonio Osmeña appears only briefly in the records of 1867 as a minor, and no other references are given for him. Right? The 3 daughters of Paula and Severino Suico pursued less normative paths. Right? These 3 will be discussed below separately, but before pursuing this topic, it is critical to explain the division of the family that took place in the 1860s. So we'll turn now to looking more at the lands, and I will take a too big break. So we can go to the next slide. All right, So what we're going to look at now is the first major division of Osmeña lands and what happens in this story. About 3 years after the death of Severino Osmeña, the children from his first marriage to Vicenta Rita devised a scheme to monopolize their father's property through the formation of a family corporation, a sociedad, right, that came to be known as Osmeña Rita y Compañía. Right. This was one of a small number of family-based companies in Cebu, and without a doubt, it was the most successful in the terms of keeping the family assets intact and using them to profit the family partners. While the ideas for the company undoubtedly originated earlier, the plan was formally launched through a series of legal transactions that began in September of 1864 and culminated less than a month later in October. In these transactions, the vast properties of Severino were temporarily, and I say temporarily, transferred to two prominent Chinese mestizos, Domingo Sison and Mariano Singson. Both of them were neighbors of Don Severino, and the family lived in a small area in the Parian along Calle de Colón. With the former, that is Domingo Sison, married to Paula's first cousin, and the latter, Mariano Sison, married to Severina's niece, Rufina Nazarena Suico y Osmeña. So there's also a pariente connection between these two people with whom the land was transferred to. Right. Less than 5 months after this transfer, in March of 1865, all these properties were reacquired by the children of Severino's first wife, now fully incorporated. They were now fully incorporated into Osmeña Rita y Compañía. While Paula Suico, viuda de Osmeña, and her children retained property of their own, they ceased to have any claim on the assets of the Osmeña Rita y Compañía. From the early 1860s to the end of the 1890s, the children of Severino Osmeña and Vicenta Rita constituted an exclusive sociedad, monopolizing the bienes of their father, in particular his urban fincas and his land holdings in Carcar and on the hinterland of Cebu City, especially land that after 1849 fell within the municipality of Talamban, or what we today call Mabolo. All right. For this time period, Don Severino's inheritance was unusually large. Right? So I'm saying for this time period, the time period here is the 1860s. So let's go to the next slide. And this will give us an idea. The first slide here, I think, let me see this slide also. Is there a second with this one? What's the next slide? I'm sorry. Just take a peek at this. Yeah, okay, these are both the same. Let's go back to the first one, and then we'll also look at the second. Thank you very much, boy. By 1876, with the death of Don Pedro Osmeña Agaton, the Compañía was administered between 1873 and 1892 by Don Victoriano Osmeña, the latter being the official gerente, or the manager of this company, from 1873, when the business became more active, up until 1892, when Don Victoriano himself passed away. While the company began to dissolve its assets in the late 1880s, it remained active until 1893, when a more serious effort, mostly by his older brother, Tomas Osmeña, right, were made to dismantle the society and to begin the process of liquidation, the division of assets among the surviving socios. So the first thing I think is to look at the socios. And this is a list on the slide that's in front of you. These are the members of the society. And if we look carefully down the list, we basically see that they are all the children of Don Severino and Vicenta Rita. But the important thing is also to notice that it also includes the wives of Victoriano, right, and of Tomas, right, in this case, and some of the others. We can look at the next slide. Okay, and I'm sorry, go back one more. I think we're one ahead here. And then is there one before that one? Yeah, this is the one I want. I'm sorry, because I think I got them reversed. I think the reason I want to show you this slide is just to show what were the assets of the company at this time. So if it says by the time of this liquidation, the original properties had expanded immensely, right? By the time it's liquidated. But if we look at the assets at this time, they don't, to us in the 21st century, these assets don't look large. But we need to remind ourselves that this is in the 1860s, and there was probably no one else in Cebu, with a few exceptions, perhaps some of the Velosos, who actually had more land than this, or people who had more assets than this. And we want to see how this works. So the urban properties and some of the land in Carcar was transferred to Domingo Sison. It then came back from Domingo Sison back to the members of the company. The other part of the lands in Panting, which was a large warehouse, a camarin, right? And the large lands in Camputao, which were later in Talamban, along with large numbers of Carabao, were transferred to Mariano Singson, all of which were returned to the family. So, but by the time, and now I'm sorry, we can go then to the 2 slides away from this one. Yeah, and then the next one. Perfect, okay, sorry. So we're coming now to the end of the liquidation, the period where the lands are now going to be divided back up among the surviving socios by 1893 to 1898. Right? If we do this, the original properties that had expanded immensely, so that this is the group of people that will now benefit from this expanded property that the brothers, particularly Tomas and Victoriano, will make in the separation of these things from this moment on. We can see, and let's move then to the next slide and see what it looks like at this point. If we look first, what we're looking at here is what this land would be worth in 1898. Again, if we look back from the 21st century, this doesn't look that big. This was an immense amount of wealth at this time. And when you realize that a lot of this wealth that we're talking about here is actually in terms of land, this is land values in 1898. The land values, of course, will go up quite considerably after this. So Osmeña Rita y Compañía's property in 1898, I will say a little bit about it. What is completely clear after the liquidation of Osmeña Rita y Compañía's assets in the late 1898 was that this estate had grown considerably since the death of Don Severino in 1861. While the family still held most of their father's lands in Talamban and Carcar, that the lands in the latter municipality and its contiguous areas like Aloginsan and Barili had expanded tremendously, resulting in what was at the time Cebu's largest landed estate. Moreover, through carefully considered purchases by Tomas and by Victoriano, the family had acquired, as noted, extensive land holdings contiguous to the city in San Nicolas, in Labangon, and in the northeastern municipality of Carmen. And if we go to the next slide, we can kind of get a glimpse of this. So in 1898, then, when Spanish period is about the end, we have a series of land holdings that are now well over 700 hectares. As the Spanish period unraveled in the aftermath of Cebu's rebellion in April 1898, the surviving Osmeña Rita heirs were financially secure, with all of these assets comfortably controlled by Severino's last surviving son from his first wife, Don Tomas Osmeña. Agaton, in fact, his full name was always written at this time as Don Tomas Osmeña Agaton y Rita, right? Making the point that he was from Vicenta Rita in the first marriage. This relatively small group of aging heirs presided over an immense estate, the value of which in 1898 rapidly would grow in the 20th century as the city and province came under American rule and the cost of land began to increase. It is safe to assume that no other family in Cebu came close to the Osmeñas in terms of landed wealth at the turn of the century. Our question now will be, who will inherit these lands? And we'll go then to the next slide and turn to the group that we left out in the earlier part was Las Hijas de Doña Paula. And we want to look at these three because this is where we get the origin of Don Sergio. By the middle of 1865, it is evident that the children of Severino with Paula Suico had been excluded from the major inheritance of their father. While the sons of Paula Suico and Severino Osmeña had been discussed above, briefly, it remains necessary for our story to focus on her daughters. Filomena, the youngest of the three, has the most ambiguous relationship with the Osmeña family and appears to have remained single, living with her mother in apparent obscurity until her death. Neither of the other two daughters, Damasa and Juana, were ever married, but both appear in the records as the mothers of very recognizable children. Damasa Osmeña y Suico, Doña Paula's eldest child, became what we may at this time call the querida, if you will, of Mariano Veloso y Rojas, the son of one of Cebu's most influential residents at the time, Maximo Veloso del Rosario. Mariano Veloso y Rojas married Carmen Rosal of Carmen, and with whom he eventually had 9 children. But in the mid-60s, after he had started his family with Carmen Rosal, Mariano Veloso initiated, or perhaps continued, we could say, a relationship in Cebu City with Damasa Osmeña y Suico. This relationship resulted in at least 2 daughters, Calixta and Natividad, who used the family name Osmeña y Suico with no connection to the Velosos, but both of whom appear to have remained single and somewhat obscure within Cebu society during this time. By far the most renowned daughter of Paula Suico was her 3rd child with Severino Osmeña, Juana Osmeña y Suico, who lives, we believe, from 1858 to 1941. Juana Osmeña y Suico, or Doña Nitay, was at around the age of 20, gave birth to Don Sergio Osmeña y Suico, which was the name that he used when he entered the Colegio de Seminario de San Carlos in 1889. We can go then to the next slide. There's another way that this is, I like to call this the women in Don Sergio's life: his grandmother, his mother, his first wife, and his second wife. So we're getting into more contemporary periods. The first 3 of these, I actually have thought of writing an essay about the first 3 that would be called something like the 3 largest funerals in Cebu between 1906 and 1941, right? These would be all 3, of course, from 1906. At 1906, Don Sergio was the governor of Cebu province. He was the elected governor of Cebu province, and that's when his grandmother died. And that was considered by the newspapers of Cebu at the time to be the largest funeral ever held in Cebu. Right? His first wife, Estefania Chong Veloso, Doña Pipong, died well, they were married in 1901, but she dies in 1918, which was also an unbelievable funeral with people coming from Manila, because by this time, Don Sergio was already a senator in Manila. And then in 1941, his mother, Juana Osmeña, who lived somewhat in obscurity most of her life, but her funeral was immense, right? And it was held at the cathedral. And one of the famous postcards that was made of the cathedral at the time was made in order to show her funeral. So Don Sergio and his mother, Doña Juana Osmeña, were not included among the Osmeña Rita side of the family in this powerful family. right? They were from the Osmeña Suico side of the family. How then did they, by 1940-41, end up as the owners of the land holdings of Sergio's grandfather, Don Severino, and of his uncles, Don Tomas and Don Victoriano? The life of Don Sergio Osmeña interestingly returns the family to the Chinese mestizo roots. Don Sergio was married, as we know, twice, in both cases to the daughters of Chinese and Chinese mestizos of the Philippines. His first wife and the mother of Sergio Jr., was Estefania Chong Veloso, the daughter of Nicasio Veloso Chong Tuico, and I have written quite a bit about that family, and it's fascinating. His second wife was Esperanza Limhap, most of you already know this, the daughter of Mariano Limhap of Manila. Once again, the central figure of this family produced two competing sets of offspring. So Don Sergio now has two separate families, but as he inherits land, which side of these families will end up with this land is, of course, somewhat contentious from the first or the second. So we can go to the next slide. And we're getting to the end here because I'm not going to get too deeply into this. I just want to provide the outline. So the question here is, what happened to the Osmeña Rita property? And when we look at this, this is a document that I got from the Court of First Instance that was in a series of records that took place between 1915 and actually all the way up until the early 1960s. But the key moment was in 1940. And we begin to see, here's the estate that we remember if we go back to Don Severino, then we go through the two uncles of Victoriano and Tomas, and now we come up to this moment and we say, whoa, all right, this has now become quite a substantial landholding. The reshuffling of the massive Osmeña estate began in 1915 through a series of legal maneuvers that over the next 3.5 decades transferred most of these land holdings to Don Sergio Osmeña and to some extent his mother and close relatives. How did this happen? Among other things, it resulted from two critical developments that I can discern from this. The first was the death of Tomas Osmeña in 1912. His uncle died in 1912. The second was the ascendancy within the Osmeña family, the family of Don Sergio Osmeña's political client, Arsenio Climaco, who was at the time the husband of Juanita Cabrera Osmeña, the eldest daughter of the seven and the eldest of the seven surviving children of Don Victoriano. So we're seeing a critical moment, the death of Don Tomas and the ascendancy within the family of Arsenio Climaco, who was closely allied at the time politically. And Arsenio will, of course, go on to become the governor of Cebu, but he's married to Juanita Cabrera. And at that time, Juanita is the eldest of the surviving heirs of Don Victoriano. In essence, to make this a long story short, Don Sergio's lawyers, both in and out of court, arranged for the legal heirs of Osmeña Rita estate to take portions of their shares and walk away, leaving the bulk of the estate to the leading political figure of the day, Don Sergio Osmeña, speaker at the time when it starts of the Asamblea Filipina, and his mother, Juana Osmeña y Suico. Arrangements had to be made with Vicenta Rafols, Rafol y Osmeña, and with Osmeña y Rafols, who was at the time a Dominican nun. They also had to be made with Agustina Rafols, viuda de Tomas Osmeña. They also had to be made with Januaria Cabrera, viuda de Victoriano Osmeña, and all of the seven children of Victoriano. So all of them through the representation of Arsenio Climaco. All of these arrangements had to be made. Some of them were made in court and many of them were made out of court, but they all ended up being reflected in court, right? Though it took some 25 years to work it out, in the end, the bulk of the Osmeña Rita lands and other assets came under control of the Osmeña Suico side of the family, in particular Don Sergio and his mother. Right? Between October 1940 and April 1941, 2 deaths occurred. Only 8 months before the beginning of the Japanese occupation, and only a short time before the evacuation of Don Sergio to the United States as the Vice President of the Commonwealth. The first event in October of 1840 was the death of Vicenta Cabrera Osmeña, the Dominican nun, right, who prior to her death signed over some of her property that she held in an arrangement that was made to Juana Osmeña, the mother of Don Sergio. The second, of course, was the death of Juana Osmeña herself, right, in 1941 on the eve of the Japanese occupation. It is critical to observe that this long, not well publicized legal maneuver began while Don Sergio was still married to his first wife, Estefania Chondeloso, and the mother of 12 of his children, by most accounts, a dominant figure in the family's economic life. I mention this because now we're going to see as we move, it's no sooner do we then get another reshuffling of the land, we begin to see another family division that comes in to sort of contest the shuffling that occurred before this. Doña Pipang died in 1918, leaving behind her 12 children. Within a year, Don Sergio had remarried, this time to a Chinese mestiza from Manila, Esperanza Limhao, quite a bit younger than he was. Right. So while the land transfers played out over the next 25 years up until the early 40s, some of these lands came under Don Sergio's ownership during the time of his marriage to Doña Esperanza, not during his marriage which ended in 1918 with Doña Pipang's death. This, of course, would lead to what would be another drama between the Osmeñas, 2 families of Osmeñas. I'm going to leave this part of it, I think, because there are probably people in the audience who know as much or more about this than I do because it's more contemporary. But let me just conclude by saying, at his death in 1961, a century after the death of his grandfather, Severino Osmeña, in 1861, and Don Sergio died in 1961, Don Sergio was remembered as a significant, indeed dominant political figure, generally recalled as the old man of Cebu, or also the great Filipino statesman. What is not generally remembered is that he was also one of the largest landowners in Cebu. We may never know how much land Don Sergio owned, but it should be recorded that he was one of the great statesmen, as he is legitimately referred to, was also one of the nation's most dominant landed oligarchs. As an afterword, we can say that this brief overview of this story can be told with a far more detail than I told it tonight. And if we get into some of the discussions later, it could also be with a lot more drama. But I'm going to leave the story here now. But let's please note, for those of you who know the story a little bit more than others, I would want to note that among the core lands that are listed on the list that you see on your thing is originating from the Osmeña Rita side. There are also lands at the bottom, particularly the ones that come from Bourbon, Asturias, and other places like that, and even Toledo, if we threw it down, that are not a part of this exact story. They come from other stories, and those stories are also quite interesting. So I thank you for your attention and look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Mike Cullinane, for the very interesting lecture. In case some of you here are wondering why we're having the Osmeña family as the topic of our talk this month. Well, October is the month particularly October 19 is the death anniversary of Don Sergio Osmeña Sr., one of the great men Cebu has ever produced. So, yes, I think the floor is now ready for your questions.
How do you want to, do we want to have oral people ask
Yes,
questions, or will they put them
maybe.
into the?
Yes. First, I have a question here from the audience. It says, um, wait. Yes. It's quite. Was the intermarriage of the Osmeñas tolerated by the Catholic Church, knowing that their cousins are related to each other? That's one
Yeah,
question from the audience.
I mean, the actual marriages, the Catholic Church is very good about marriages. So therefore, the actual marriages took place all in the church. And remember that baptisms are also always accepted by the church. So the church may not accept an illegitimate marriage. In fact, throughout the Spanish period, where the Catholic Church was much more dominant in its being able to control the society, if a woman had a child in Cebu or anywhere else in the Philippines and she was not married, the father's name was never mentioned in the parish registers. It was always put that so and so had a child, the name of the child is being baptized at this point, and the father is when it says the father's position, it says padre no conocido. And this was very standard. Now, if the couple later got married, the church register would be amended. They would go back into the parish books and add the name of the father, but not unless there was a legitimate marriage. So, I mean, the whole idea of anaksagawas is something that the church could handle, because the most important thing to the church was the baptism of the child, right, and the condoning of an official marriage. So, and remember that Don Severino's 2 marriages were legitimate marriages. Don Sergio's 2 marriages were legitimate marriages. There's nothing wrong with the marriages, right? The case of Juana and Damasa, right, when their children were born, the records of the births of those child were recorded without recording the father. This is why, I mean, Gavin Bagares was going to, I think, one time talk about like who was the father of Don Sergio. Gavin and I have talked about that forever, you know, and we think we know who it is, but it's like, but that was never registered in a parish church, that marriage. The birth of Don Sergio would have been registered.
Yeah, because that's the second question is actually related to what you just said, Dr. Cullinane. Can you speak a little more about Don Sergio's father? That's one of the questions. But well, that's your choice. You might.
No, I don't mind. Is it? There were a couple of newspaper articles that came out by members of the Osmeña family in the Sun Star several years back, quite a few years back now, where it was that the family itself. So I can remember myself. So here's my favorite story of this. I had an interview, and I think it was at the Celebrity Steakhouse. And I would challenge those of you in the audience to know, where was the Celebrity Steakhouse? It was at Fuente Osmeña, and it was a restaurant there. And I had an interview in the mid-70s. Prior to, this is with Sonny Osmeña, and I had an interview with him, and one of the questions I asked him was, who was Don Sergio's father? And so he said, here's what he told me at the time. He said that I often wondered also who Grandpa's father was. And he says one time he went to Don Sergio when he was a small boy, and he asked Don Sergio, you know, who's your father? You know, and Don Sergio was sitting on his lap, and he says Don Sergio removed him from his lap and scolded him never to ask him that again. So it was that's later. I, of course, have investigated this on many, many directions. And even members of the Osmeña family, as I mentioned in the Sun Star, came out several years ago saying that the father was Antonio Sanson. This is why Gavin, Bagares Sanson, Gavin has been interested in this, because Antonio Sanson was a major figure in Cebu in the late 1890s, right? And in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, and was himself one of the owners of the lands in Bourbon that eventually were inherited by Don Sergio through his father-in-law, Nicasio Veloso, Chong Veloso, sorry.
Okay.
So that's, I think it was Antonio Sanson, but I'm willing to have somebody convince me otherwise.
Okay. So I think there are like 3 questions related to that particular question. So it's, it's quite interesting. Another question here, it says, to which generation does Mayor Tom and Governor Lito belong? Former governor.
I said in the halfway through, my focus of the original thing was on Don Severino Osmeña, right? Who was the father of Don Sergio, which would then make him the great grandfather of both Tommy Osmeña and of Sonny. In the way the genealogy works, there is a slide that has some of that on it.
Okay. Another interesting question. Is there a sketch plan that would show the locations of the Osmeña properties in Parian?
In fact, if you go down Parian, Romulo Sabellion actually has, and some of the city people before, if you walk down Colón today, or I don't even know, I haven't been to Colón for a year and a half, which is very sad. I haven't been able to get back to Cebu because of the pandemic, but there are official government signs all along Colón that register where these houses were among, and the Osmeñas are both there. Right? And the Osmeñas are kind of interesting because if you look at Cebu history, a lot of the wealthy Chinese mestizos moved out of Parian in the 1850s and particularly in the 1860s, and they moved over to the other side of town, which was called Lutaos, this would be south of Santo Niño as you go down into that area. The Osmeñas remained in Parian, so that Don Severino and even Don Tomas and Don Victoriano maintained their primary homes and even some of their warehouses, even though they acquire warehouses down in the old commercial district of Lutaos, that they were pretty much stayed in the Parian and along Colón. Colón doesn't look anything at all today like it would have looked then.
Okay. Yeah. Another interesting question, Dr. Cullinane. Have you done any research on the lands of the Osmeñas? I mean, what happened to the lands during the Marcos and the Marcos era? So
this would be.
Would you know the current?
I would not know, but the people who would know what happened to their lands are people who are still alive. I mean, there are lots of people who are still alive who would be able to tell us, if they wished to, what happened to the lands of the lands were divided up among. There are many children. I think one of the things that becomes very clear when you look at the Osmeña genealogy, there are a lot of children. There are a lot of heirs. So one of the people, and one of the things you have when you have a lot of children is the land gets divided, and it gets broken up. Other siblings come in, other marriages, other husbands, other cousins, and you begin to see the land breaking up. I don't have any specific information about whether the Marcoses attempted to take any of the Osmeña lands. There was a very great attempt, I do remember, to force the Asturias lands to go into the land reform, and they avoided that during the Marcos, because I was actually visited. I visited those lands in the 1970s and early 80s. Okay. But I don't, my research is really from the 19th and early 20th centuries.
Okay.
But there are lots of people, there are probably people in the audience here if there are members of the Osmeña family who are around who could probably answer that question better than I can.
Okay. Could you tell us more about the, I know this is not actually part of the talk, but could you tell us more about the Sanson? What happened to the Sanson descendants?
Well, they're still around. Gavin is one of them.
Yeah, I don't know if Gavin is here, no, with us.
Is Gavin in the audience or? No, I know Gavin is hiding out in Moalboal. No, the Sanson family. So the book, I'm about to publish a book at the University of San Carlos Press called The Chinese Mestizos of Cebu, 1750 to 1900. Right? The Sansons and the Osmeñas and the Velosos and many others are prime characters of that book. So if you go back to the late 18th century, at the same time that we're looking at Severino Osmeña, there are many, there's Jose Hilario Sanson, his son, there's a whole series of Sansons that play a very major role in the development of the Parian and the development of Cebu's economy during the late 18th and the early 19th centuries. Two of the Sanson family members held the highest positions in the Spanish colonial government for anyone who would be considered a native. Right, and one of them would be Jose Hilario Sanson, and then Valeriano Sanson were the escribano público of Cebu, which is as high as you could get in the Spanish bureaucratic system during that time.
Okay. There's another question, Dr. Cullinane. How were the properties of Don Sergio divided between his two families from his two wives?
You're talking about Don Sergio's family.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Is it the documents that I have seen are contested? So what I have not seen, so if you go back to the documents that I have seen, they originated in 1915 and they go all the way up to 1963, and what is clear by 1963 that the clear land divisions between Doña Pipang's children and Esperanza Limhop's children had not yet been fully resolved, and that there were still contestations over that. And as I understood that legal case, the case was over this land came into the possession of Don Sergio over a very long period of time. And during that same period of time, Doña Pipang had died in 1918 and Sergio remarried. Very quickly he remarried, almost within a year after the death of Doña Pipang, he marries Esperanza Limhop, who then of course outlives him for quite some time. And then her three children can enter into under her auspices in the legal case. How it ends in terms of a division after the 1963 period, I don't know because I have not seen any of those legal documents. So if I were pursuing the late 20th century division of these lands, probably what I would do would be try to go to the court of first instance, the court, but if not, I would try to interview members of the family and see what they can tell me. The members of the family, to some extent, know what happened, and they'll have their own versions of what happened. And I'm sure that it was, I can't imagine it being anything other than very complicated. And then once you get individual members of families, they want to get their share because they then have families. And they want then to use the land that they could acquire from their father to develop their own families, right? And so the humans just keep going, so someday, somebody who isn't even born yet will be studying the feuds of other families of people who are born today. And I'm sorry, but I don't really know what happened by the time we get into the 1960s.
Okay.
So
I was interested in what you said earlier in your talk, that you have a plan to publish a book or story about these three biggest funerals in Cebu. When do we expect it?
Well, I would like to probably produce that as an article for the Philippine Quarterly for Culture and Society, the journal published at San Carlos. And it came to me as I was doing this one, because I went back into my own records. If you go into the newspapers of Cebu from the beginning of the 20th century, newspapers like Bagong Kusog, Ang Kagubot, Bagong Kusog, and newspapers like this, they're full of information. And one of the things that I had taken down a lot was the 1906 funeral of Paula Suico. It was like the newspapers themselves are saying that this was the most unbelievable funeral that had ever been held in Cebu City. And of course, I'm looking at the date, 1906, and I know that in 1906, Don Sergio was governor of Cebu, and this was his displaced grandmother who had just died. And he got everyone to come to that funeral. The same thing happened with Doña Pipang when she died in 1918. The newspapers are full of all of the people coming down from Manila, and all of the things that are occurring around her funeral. Was a very large funeral held at the cathedral. And then in 1941, Juana Osmeña, his mother, if you go into the records of Cebu, you find almost no mention of Don Sergio's mother, Juana. She almost disappears. She lives in somewhat of an isolation among her relatives. Is that she's not like when her son is the most famous politician in Cebu, but she is not standing on the platform with him when he's receiving honors. But when she dies in 1941 and the funeral is held in Cebu, this is a huge occasion, so much so that someone took a photo of the cathedral, and that is the postcard that is sent out about the cathedral through much of the immediate post-war period. If you want a picture of Cebu, they show the cathedral, and then you look at the note, and it says it's the funeral of a famous person. But then if you go to the newspapers and you look, you find the same picture in Bagong Kusog talking about the funeral of Doña Juana Osmeña. So I'll probably write that up because it's just an interesting footnote to the history of Cebu. Call it the three funerals.
Yeah, that would be an interesting read. So I'm afraid we're running out of time. Last two questions. One is there an Osmeña Gaisano connection, and where does this lie, or where does the link lie? Do I know for sure whether there's a Gaisano connection in terms of DNA? No. Whether there's a connection in terms of links, political, social, economic links, I would say obviously there is. So this question comes down to, again, who was Don Sergio's father? Right, because one of the other people who is recommended as being Don Sergio's father is Pedro Gotiauco, Pedro Singson Gotiauco, who is one of the people who for a long period of time, people assumed that he was the real father, and that the Gotiauco building, which we all know in Cebu that is now gutted, is it still there? Gotiauco, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, the old Gotiauco building that was gutted out. That building was very near where Doña Paula Suico had her panaderia. So it was, the idea was that Gotiauco was the father of Don Sergio, in which case they were related. That Doña Modesta Gaisano was like a sister of Don Pedro. Now, I don't believe that was so myself, but I think there's a lot to say about why that is an important fiction, right? If I were Don Sergio, I would want to be connected to Don Pedro Gotiauco and all of his family. is that I would want them to be igagaw with me, and Serhing seemed to also be very close to certain members of the Chinese community during his time. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, I don't believe that there's a DNA connection. that I don't know that there's anything. Therefore, I think it's really interesting to me to understand that, but more in terms of socio-political relationships more than anything else.
Okay, one last question, Dr. Cullinane, before we end. Before we synthesize your talk, how can we follow your research in the future?
For me, this is pretty, I think I have an advantage that I have been able to use, and that is that it's called research grants. Right. So research grants that I have been fortunate enough to get have allowed me to do a number of things. I'm also fortunate because for almost 4 years, I taught at the University of San Carlos. So my research was funded in part by teaching at the University of San Carlos, which allowed me to go up to Manila. It allowed me to go all over the parishes of Cebu, mostly by motorcycle, and go into the parish records. But the Philippines has fantastic records. Right? The University of Santo Tomas has almost complete records of anyone who went to school there. The University of San Carlos in Mabolo, the seminary, has almost complete records of people, and Gabino knows this also, Gabino Guerrero, because we spent quite a bit of time photographing them with my little camera. But so you can, the seminario has records of students who went there. The notarial records at the Philippine National Archives are fantastic for Cebu. The newspaper collections at the Cebuano Studies Center are major resources, and you wouldn't have to leave Cebu at all. You can just go in and read the newspapers at the Cebuano Studies Center. So there's no shortage of materials to read for the history of Cebu. That history is concentrated, however, on the sort of early 19th century to the present. It's hard to get a lot of really good materials that go all the way back to, say, the 16th or the 17th century. Some of those materials exist in Spain, and they have not yet been properly utilized. I think there's a lot of things in Spain that we haven't found yet, but in the Philippines, you don't have to go anywhere. There's lots of stuff.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cullinane. So
thank you.
Before we end the session, I'd like to ask one of Hambin's honorary members. He's better known as one of the best tour guides in Cebu when you talk about heritage walk tours. So I'm talking about Cabino Guerrero. Cabino.
Before he speaks, I have something to say. So Bino, did you notice that Bino's head is replacing Don Sergio's head on the 50 peso bill?
Okay,
the last slide is quite shocking. It's shows how vast the land holdings that the Osmeña. So from the beginning up to now, the Osmeña is a very dynamic family. It transcends almost 2 centuries. Dr. Mike Cullinane talks about how the obscure beginning of the Osmeña family, but I'm sure throughout this very interesting history from pre-Don Sergio Osmeña and post-Don Sergio Osmeña, one thing is for sure, that the Osmeña family is not going back to its obscure beginning. So thank you very much, Mike. And also we would like to thank the Osmeñas in the audience. We have Osmeña from the both side, from the Linghap side and the Chong Biloso side. So daghang salamat. This is Cabino Guerrero Osmeña.
Thank you, Cabino. So on behalf of Hambin, we'd like to thank everyone who's registered or who has watched the talk via Facebook Live and via Zoom. Next week, since it's going to be November already, Hambin will be holding another talk, this time on Cebuano cemeteries. So there will be 2 topics. Cebuano Cemetery Art by Professor Raymond Fernandez at the UP Cebu Fine Arts Department, and Cabino Guerrero, who will bring us to a virtual tour of the cemeteries in Cebu. Okay, so please stay tuned for that talk. So again, thank you very much. On behalf of Hambin, my name is Boboy Costas. Thank you very much. Good morning. Kanatong tanan. Daghang salamat.
Postmortem boy.